Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone here present and those joining us online. We want to welcome you to this event by the Africa Caucus at the Harvard Kennedy School, sponsored by the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs and supported by the Center for African Studies here at Harvard University. It is a pleasure to have all of you here with us. And we're looking forward to a really lively discussion and also really great insights from His Excellency the Ambassador, Dr. Martin Kimani, who is here to talk to us about the African future. Our panel will be consisting of himself and moderated by Natalie Colbert, who is the Executive Director of the Belfer Center. To our guest, His Excellency Dr. Martin Kimani, PhD, CBS, is Kenya's permanent representative to the United Nations in New York with the rank of Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary. He has recently served as the President's Special Envoy for Countering Violent Extremism and as the Director of Kenya's National Counterterrorism Center, and is the strategic initiative, and also the head of the strategic initiatives in the Executive Office of the President. Prior to that, he served as a permanent representative of the UN at the United Nations in Nairobi, as well as the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP, and also UN Habitat. In the past 20 years, he's worked at a senior level in the global currency underwriters in the bond market and is a political risk advisory and provided advisory services to underwriters and other corporates. He's also worked on peace and security in the Horn of Africa and in East Africa. Ambassador Kimani is a fellow of the Africa Leadership Initiative and a member of the Aspen Global Leadership Network. He was a Distinguished African Fellow at the South African Institute of International Affairs in 2013. Ambassador Kimani holds a PhD in War Studies from King's College London, University of London. Please join me in welcoming the Ambassador to give his remarks.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much to all of you for joining me here this afternoon to listen to me. I realize how busy you all are in these first halting days of in-person meetings. And I want to start by thanking the Harvard Kennedy School, Natalie Colbert, and the Belfer Center, the Center for Africa, the Africa Caucus, for the opportunity to be here today. And to do a special thank you to Thomas Kisimbi for the kind introduction and your great generosity in taking your valuable time in shaping this event and my time here at Harvard. I have to say that since I got here yesterday and in meeting the students I've met, especially those from the Africa Caucus, I was just struck by the diversity of experience and just the strength of ambition and optimism among them. It left me feeling very inspired, and I felt for a moment like reapplying to go back to school. I have to caution this wonderful audience that I'll be speaking in my personal capacity and not communicating as much Kenyan policy, even though I will explain some positions we have taken. I do that not to avoid any particular issue, but rather to step back to consider matters from a broader, more historical perspective before I plunge back to my world in New York, which is in the trees, and you barely can see the forest from where I stand. I'm very glad to be doing that here at Harvard before all of you talented students, some of you who are in the mid-career part of your life, others who are trying to pivot to new horizons. And I really hope that my speech here today, more than being a technical treatise on policy, which you all learn every single day, will help you connect your personal mission to the many institutional opportunities that are available to you. I will do that by speaking about the African story and its importance, not only on to how it guides our diplomatic engagement in New York, but perhaps its meaning to your own practice, whether you're African or not. I will propose that we're well advised to better understand how our individual and institutional efforts fit within the oldest and most diverse story ever told. But let me start with the 21st, or I think it may have been the 22nd of February, when we had an emergency sitting of the UN Security Council that was called following the recognition by the Russian Federation of two breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine. On that evening, which you can imagine was a very tense evening in the Security Council, on behalf of the Kenyan delegation, I told a 4-minute story of Africa's response to retreating European colonial empires. By that time, we had been a non-permanent member of the Security Council for just over a year. We had in that time made hundreds of statements which very few people cared about. And every one of those statements have been about a political crisis leading to extensive violence with significant fatalities and ensuing humanitarian emergencies. And whether we were commenting about conflict situations in the Balkans or Yemen or Myanmar, or the multiple conflict situations in Africa, our practice as a delegation throughout that time has been to identify solutions that reflect what we perceive as African positions and interests. We do that because we assume that African peoples, as expressed by the official positions of our governments, the African Union, and regional blocs, have irreducible interests in global governance that we must advance in our daily diplomatic practice. So in the twists and turns and pressures of life in the Security Council, we have very often needed to stake positions that emerge not necessarily from a direct reading of a decision by the Peace and Security Council of the African Union or a particular document from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but rather from our Pan-Africanist reading of the situation. Our 2 years in the Council is consciously shaped to represent primarily African interests because we locate Kenyan interests within that broader set of interests. And by Pan-Africanist reading, I mean acting according to the call of unity in action among Africans and the need for resistance to any form of geopolitical control or manipulation that is contrary to the security and well-being of our people. That very evening and during every meeting that has followed on the war in Ukraine, the 3 African countries on the Security Council have called for respect to be shown by all powers for the self-determination, territorial integrity, sovereignty, and political independence of states. For this reason, anticipating the threat of war that now loomed ever more darkly after the recognition of these 2 breakaway provinces, Kenya, Gabon, and Ghana all criticized the Russian Federation's recognition of those breakaway regions. The military operation that followed was not then, and is still not, defensible in relation to the bedrock principles it has violated. But seen from the perspective of the story told by the Russian Federation and its sense of being existentially threatened by the West, it could be understood, even if not endorsed. That is the point I think I'm trying to get to about the stories we tell that allow us to make sense of our world. We heard both Russia and Ukraine tell their stories. which stretch back for many generations, as far back as 1,000 years ago. And it was one of those rare moments in which you hear two diametrically opposed versions of history that then meet in the battlefield. So powerfully opposed are these stories that today thousands are dying because of that clash. That is the power of story to make or to destroy. Every other delegation in the council that evening also told a story responding to this singularly dangerous moment. They ranged from the defensive to the transactional and to strong condemnations, even by members of the council who have themselves repeatedly breached the very same principles. If you go back to each one of those statements, you will see clearly that they all emerged from very specific histories being used to interpret a common set of facts. We ended up in different positions, and there we have stayed until this hour, unable to find the wherewithal to fulfill our mandate to protect international peace and security. Gabon, Ghana, and Kenya mounted a robust defense of a global order that in many ways has not been as protective of our sovereignty and objectives as Africans. I believe we did so because the alternative to the principles of self-determination, territorial integrity, sovereignty, and political independence being adhered to are too awful to contemplate. In other words, no one has come up with an alternative yet. These principles were also the cornerstones of our fight against colonialism and the key to sustaining our future freedom from external control. And also because long before they were articulated in the UN Charter, these principles were deeply embedded into our African stories. My key argument today is not about the tragedy of Ukraine or the dozens of other conflict situations that are being considered by the Security Council. It is about the radical impact to our actions that emerges from how we tell and think of the African story. I want to suggest to all of you, perhaps you will agree, that the shorter the history you consider important, the shorter your future horizons, the more minor and negligible your efforts, the more deeply demoralized and demotivated you are. I have seen any number of political histories of Africa that begin our story at independence from colonial rule. Others begin in the Berlin Conference of the late 19th century and describe in minute detail the depredations of colonialism. Then there are those that lay out the horrors of the transatlantic and Indian Ocean slave trades. And all these are important. But our story is far more than the oppressions we have suffered at the hands of outsiders. Each of these historical accounts locate the brutal power of the slaver and the colonialist at the center of the African world. They then often lead to comparisons of how African countries have performed as compared to the wealthiest states. So 6 decades into our journey as independent modern nation states, the verdict is mostly quite damning. And there's any number of statistics available here at the Kennedy School that will tell you that on a number of measures, we are underperforming Denmark. And we are judged, and far worse, we judge ourselves too often as failures. From this, a perverse and damaging and even crippling story of helplessness emerges. It saps the hope and optimism that we need. It makes us prey to predatory states and businesses. And on a personal level, it leads to the cynical attitudes that are the first stage in the journey to corruption and criminality. The limits of the historical timeline that many of the stories we are here to have come with a psychological impact that makes the future hazy and barely can we conceive of our efforts in generational terms. As a boy growing up, And to be honest, until today, I loved science fiction. And I was talking about that at some point yesterday. And it became apparent at some point as I was reading all these books from Asimov to the rest of them, Arthur C. Clarke, that man's leap to the stars did not include Africans. I could never see an African name in the starships headed to out of our solar system. And that was why I always cite, this is in brackets, recommend you pick up Octavia Butler's novels and the increasing number of science fiction by writers of African descent. And this is because to be an intentional ancestor, which is a great goal of African life, on whose efforts future generations will build on, you have to be able to see that those generations are coming and to plant the seed that will be the tree they shelter under. In the fullness of time, the decades since independence, the brutal absurdity of the Berlin Conference, the centuries of slave raids will be a small fraction of the time arc of African civilization. If we tell and live a fuller history, our descendants will come to regard our present condition as a slightly surreal and difficult to believe history. This day is coming one way or another. It is left to us only to determine how soon it will arrive. We can hasten its arrival by choosing very deliberately to locate our efforts in a different timeline than we're accustomed to. That is to say, ladies and gentlemen, that this African story I'm talking about is many stories told by many millions of people. It is diverse experience, millions of acts of multi-generational collaboration and future making. It is driven along by the invention of the world's most diverse social and cultural technologies that are embedded in the world's most diverse set of languages, traditions, and rituals. Africa has by far the richest cultural diversity in the world. This means, in actuality, that we have invented the most hacks into the sheer challenge of survival and prosperity. Our many cultures are filled with invention and responsiveness and flexibility as they carry generation after generation across the gulf of time. My own people, the Kikuyu of Kenya, were inventors of detailed processes of developing upstanding citizens in a rigorous process of education, tests, and mentorship. Reason was a high aspiration that lived in a welcome tension with spiritual and religious practices built into everyday life. Freedom of speech and thought were inviolable. Tyranny was resisted, and the cultural frameworks to resist it were inserted so deeply that language was built to embed them in our minds. Honesty, hard work, and wise civic speech were praised, and the young were offered paths to achieve them. Earlier today, here at Harvard, I met Professor Caroline Elkins, who has written on the brutal colonial response to our insistence on our freedom and independence. But I want to say that long before Britain's gulags and concentration camps in Kenya that she writes about, the colonial regime had deliberately and insidiously attacked our cultural foundations. But far, far worse than what they did is that we ourselves largely abandoned our own cultural technologies. We abandoned them to new monotheistic religions that came with missionaries and imams that told us that our own long traditions and religious practice were the work of the devil. And we threw so much of our culture into the rubbish bin. The baby was thrown out with the bathwater, and what remained was cast as inferior and not a vehicle in which to effectively maneuver in the 20th and 21st centuries. We abandoned the world's greatest cultural treasures, a wealth that knows few equals, that stretches from the great cities of Africa that are as old as any mankind can boast of. The splendid Benin bronzes that are slowly making their way back to the continent. The fractal mathematics that underlay how many homesteads, villages, and towns were laid out. Great Zimbabwe, the Swahili city-states, the sophisticated diplomacy of the Congo Kingdom, the Zunza house painting, the streetlights in Mansa Musa's Timbuktu, with its ancient libraries and culture of learning, the astronomical inquiries of the Dogon philosophers and mathematicians, the military strategy of the Zulu Empire. There is not enough time today to list the immense accomplishments in the African past. But let me be clear, I'm not here to just boast of past greatness. Far more important than the objects we built are the ideas and ideals that they represented. Across the continent, the value of the human being was deeply linked to belonging to the community. Storytelling was written into every facet of our cultural existence. I recall observing a peace negotiation in southern Ethiopia when I was directing the IGAD conflict and early warning mechanism. These two groups had clashed over water and pasture, which happened whenever there was a lack on one of their areas from the other. And they started the mediation by telling the stories of how they came to be, the past treaties that they had agreed with one another, and the previous crises that they had overcome on the basis of negotiation. For those of you looking for a PhD subject, there's a very good PhD subject on the treaties of resource sharing amongst African peoples. They are long-standing, highly flexible, and continuously adjusting to the realities on the ground. I've never seen a book about it. Maybe it's there, but I just haven't seen it. So I want to propose to you today that our work must be located in this longer-standing, deeper, and more diverse African story. It is a story large enough to contain the million stories we are each telling, so that those stories that we as individuals and as specific institutions tell are carried in a great traveling caravan, linking our past with a distant, promising future. Perhaps by now, if you're a very practical bent, you will be asking, how does this actually matter? What does it mean in practice? Let me describe just briefly what it means for a delegation in the Security Council to have a permanent representative who says these things to Harvard students. When we locate our diplomacy in the story I've just told, it has an electrifying effect. Because it means that our conviction that our story matters means that even when you're called at 9 p.m. at night in February to discuss the looming war in Ukraine, in your mind, you think the African story matters. And because it matters, that's what you talk about. It's so easy to not do that, because there's so many ways and tools and words that diplomacy offers that have nothing to do with your particular story. It has meant that we reach out as a delegation to African peoples in the Caribbean. It means that the Kenyan delegation has used its platform to reach out in solidarity with the people of Haiti and Afro-Colombian communities that suffer many forms of marginalization and exclusion. And we have insisted, when those countries have come to the Security Council, that the fate of the African people within their borders is of concern to the Security Council. And that was the first. It has allowed us to interpret the sixth region in the Constitutive Act of the African Union as a political bridge to African people in every corner of the world. For the Kenya delegation, the Sahelian citizen who is on a raft as we speak, headed to Europe, is our concern. And the African American who will experience police brutality is also our concern. Their security and well-being concern us and impel us to act in their stead in the debates at the United Nations. And this is not a judgment about our power to effect immense change. It is only where we choose to stand. To the talented people in our young people in our delegation, and in this audience, who want to take action, for instance, to reduce climate change, locating such action within the wider sweep of our story is to act as the descendants of people with a protective and spiritual attitude to nature. To understand that conservation and sustainability were written into the very languages that we spoke and how we treated the environment around us. So that means we'll come to that debate not as assistants or objects of foreign conservation, but as long-standing champions of these efforts. It makes all the difference in the world how you approach the matter and who you believe you are as you do so. They will also insist that global climate action cannot be undertaken, as is now the growing tendency, at the expense of our economic betterment. For those of you who are interested in education, our story opens up revolutionary paths. You will look into the cultural toolkits in your countries, and you will discover in them valuable innovations that can open new vistas of confidence and possibility to your students. I had an opportunity to speak on this subject a few weeks ago to some amazing documentary filmmakers at DocuBox in Nairobi. They were all telling different and valuable stories, and I encouraged them to locate their films within this broader sweep as they saw fit, knowing that its powerful echoes and connections would have an impact on the viewpoint and the perspectives that they would offer. So rarely has Africa desperately needed its storytellers to match the rare skills of the griot as it now does, as the African people continue to grow under a limiting, often racist and demoralizing story of themselves. I want to come back to finish by coming back to those core principles of African unity, self-determination, territorial integrity, and sovereignty. They're the pillars of our story at this moment in time, because we are witness to the atrocity and suffering that has befallen us when they are violently and insidiously assaulted by others. We need to fit our diverse efforts and experiences to this bigger African story, because it will allow us to shape a new mental, political, and economic operating system for ourselves and our communities. If we occupy it and tell it and deepen its articulation, it will be the clearest and most welcoming framework for respectful collaboration with the world. And I say all this to not only speak to the Africans, even though they are my primary audience in my mind right now, because I have this rare platform, but to say that Africans are not the only ones with solutions to problems in Africa. And there's certainly many people of goodwill and knowledge and resources who find themselves in search of alignment to bring those solutions to us. To them, it is only to say welcome, welcome, as long as you always respect the ownership of Africans for their problems, the ownership of Africans to their territory, their resources, and that their perspectives, even when wrong, are the perspectives of their own home. And once that is understood, and Africans themselves understand themselves better, embrace their own story better, to become even more powerful partners, then we can work together to change the world as we know it, and we can always make the African story a resource for the entire world. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Ambassador, for those remarks. We are going to transition into the second phase of our talk today, so we'll have a chance to hear from our audience, both in the room and on Zoom, any questions that you have for Ambassador Kimani. So I'm going to take moderator's privilege and ask the first question. And I wanted to, Ambassador, follow up on a theme that you highlighted today, but also, of course, in your speech to the UN Security Council on the eve of Russia's invasion in Ukraine. And this centrality of history, and in particular the historical legacies of colonialism and the liberation struggles in Africa, and how they informed views of contemporary geopolitics on the continent. So of course, you mentioned this in your speech at the UN Security Council, but not necessarily all African countries either voted the same way or were vocal in potential support for condemning the Russian invasion. And the question is how, in those cases, did the colonial legacy maybe shape their views of strategic choice and not being beholden to falling in line with certain external expectations about where they should fall on X or Y side of politics. And so I just wanted to ask your perspective on how you see variation in African countries' approach to their role in their own foreign policy or geopolitics, and how it's shaped and centered around their experience with their colonial legacy.
Yeah, well, the one thing a diplomat should never ever do is interpret the diplomatic efforts of other diplomats. I'll pay a very heavy price when I get to New York. But I'll say that in the curious politics of the Security Council, we're all extraordinarily sensitive about the positions we hold relative to each other. In a strange way, it's like it's a complex adaptive system. So each move you make, the other 14 shuffle in response, and then each one that shuffles, all of you shuffle in response to that one. So we have a minute sensitivity to even when somebody says we're not aligned, well, the two of you, that non-aligned is completely different, even though, and I think we may be the only ones who care about this. The rest of the world just sees us paralyzed and unable to solve the big problems. I will say that I was really taken by how clearly the African countries in the Security Council spoke. We all approached the matter differently, but to us, we stood with the principles of the UN Charter, and we did not do it in a mincing fashion. We did it very, very clearly. And I thought it's one of those ironies where sometimes those who appear to have a disadvantage can sometimes be the great champions for everybody else. And you see that all the time. I mean, you saw that here in the US, where, I'm not likening being in the Security Council being the civil rights movement, but sometimes having the disadvantage, perhaps being relatively weaker than the forces that are moving at the time, also creates an interesting perspective from you. And the fact that we did that, I think, emerged directly from our colonial experience, our sensitivity and sympathy and empathy for any country that is attacked by a more powerful one in pursuit of, however those are defended, but just the view and the vision of that happening. And so that to the Africans, I thought, in the Security Council, it felt very clear. That doesn't mean all African countries agreed, but when you're in the cut and thrust of the Security Council, you're extraordinarily sensitive to the maneuvers of the most powerful states. And we thought that in that time, it was important that our people hear us speak up for what we have lost all those generations ago, and perhaps what the stances we should have had. A firmer stance against colonialism, a stronger resistance to it. So that was the stance, and that's what Kenya took from it. Even though we understood that the issue is not that simple, there are other aspects that are also very important. There are perspectives that the Russian Federation has it has talked about for a decade that need to be listened to. But for that moment, we were very much inspired by the principles that we embraced to overcome colonialism.
Yeah, thank you. All right, I want to leave as much time as possible for our audience questions. So let me start by asking if there's any questions here in the room, and then we can go to the Zoom audience. Yes, we have one over here.
So bear with me. I have kind of a broad, very kind of three-part question. So I want to go back to what you said about external threats to the continent. And when I think about the continent, I think of two of the greatest resources that Africa has to offer are the minerals and the wildlife. And I'm curious what your take is. This is one of my three-part question. What is your take on China's position, the way China has moved into so many countries within the continent? Last time I checked, there were about 37 countries. And they have taken over some of the most important minerals in the continent. And it is a threat to the continent's national sovereignty. So that's one part. What is your take on the China position, the way it's moved in throughout the continent? It's threatened many countries. And then, so I see that as relating to your external threat. Then the other thing is policy that's severely lacking, some sort of continuity with policy within the countries themselves. And do you think there's an opportunity within the African Union or within the leaders to create cohesive policy between some of the countries within regions to protect things like wildlife corridors that are, right now that are being exploited and going against CITES, and there's so much corruption. And then with the minerals. And then lastly, getting my third part of my question.
If I may, let's have an ambassador respond to that, and then
right.
You can always come
I know
back around.
it was a lot. I want so much to get so much in. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your questions. I will answer them as best as I can. To begin on the resources, the important resources Africa has. I'm sure I'll add some more to your list. I know your question is well intended, and these are serious matters. So minerals and wildlife, and of course, the most important resource is really the people, our minds, our talents, and it's in harnessing African genius that we will protect our minerals, our wildlife, our commons, and that we will solve the deepest problems we have. And beyond who is there, is that Africa for some time now has had a very destructive, extractive relationship with the world. It started with the colonial time. Actually, before that, there was slavery, where the extraction of humans, right? And then moving on to the extraction of minerals and other forms of wealth. And not just in Africa, in other parts of colonial empire. So China has very quickly become the largest, if not one of the largest, trading partners to African countries. And what they have done is they have their interest in feeding their industry with the minerals that Africa has and the markets that Africa presents. So to us in Kenya, as far as the Kenyan government is concerned, and as far as I think many of the 37 countries, and I think it may even be more that are concerned, is that at a time when accessing capital and opportunity to trade was becoming more limited for a variety of reasons that we can get into, China came to Africa with an ambitious level of wanting to build infrastructure. And that was something we needed. And so for now, you will find most Africans and most African leaders will say that China has been an important partner to Africa. Now, there's been some criticism of the Chinese, and there's been some criticism of African governments for engaging with the Chinese. But we don't find much to apologize for because it is our full right. And when there's been questions about the shape of debt, and all those are questions we can deal with. But the most important takeaway for me is that Africa wants to have a diverse relationship with the world. We want to trade with China. We want investments from Malaysia. We want the United States to step up and trade more and invest more. And I think that is ultimately where every African country is going to be located. In terms of lacking policy continuity, you touched on a very important point. I do think there's some level of policy continuity. For instance, and with a light touch, every African leader I know calls their fellow leader my brother or my sister. Yeah. It's like a little tick. They go back and forth, my brother, my sister, my brother, my sister. That's a sort of strategy that is embedded in a sort of cultural way. And what is that strategy? It's a strategy of integration. You call this person your brother because you want them to see you as more than another country. You want to create a sense of shared sovereignty, a sense of common purpose. So there has been tremendous continuity in that. In fact, I would say that continuity is 100 years old or more. It starts with the old Pan-Africanist movement at the end of the 19th century, and just come, my brother, my sister, all the way to today, my fellow ambassadors, that's what we call each other. So there's one policy continuity. But to bring it to more specific frameworks, the African Union has the most extensive peace and security architecture of any regional organization on earth. Now, the record of the African Union in using that peace and security architecture is actually surprisingly good. But one doesn't quite, it doesn't make a lot of headlines. For instance, the civil war in South Sudan that broke out a few years ago. I watched as the region kept jetting in and out of South Sudan, presidents, ministers, trying to bring the two sides together. A very difficult process, but ultimately there's more stability now in South Sudan. In different situations, I have seen this again and again. Then you have the bigger frameworks like the 2063 agenda and silencing the guns agenda. These are agreed at the heads of state level. But I don't want to just sort of wave policy papers, because I think your question is about more than do you have the papers to do you implement these strategies. And here we get to the core of the matter of why there's a need to do deeper work within government to connect these continental resolutions with everyday diplomatic and policy practice. And there's a spectrum across the continent. You find, for instance, South Africa, very formidable foreign service with a lot of skilled diplomats who are very institutionally conscious of the linkages between those efforts and South African policy, from my observation. Kenya also tries to do some of that. Then there are other countries that do far less of it. So I think that linkage is something we really need to work on. And ultimately to have effect on some of those questions that you have prioritized. When we speak about wildlife corridors and corruption, corruption is definitely a problem in many African countries. But as we move forward and we get to understand the way the world is structured more, we begin to see that some of the corruption is a sort of worldwide system that has heavily depended on a sort of infrastructure that enables dishonest public servants in Africa to be able to, and other parts of the world, including the most advanced economies, to be able to hide their interests worldwide. So there's a lot of work to be done there. But let me just leave you with the sense that I increasingly have, which is that despite the profound crises going on in the Horn of Africa, in the Sahel, and elsewhere, and certainly environmental crises, that I find African states and the officials within them to be more confident now about guiding the affairs of their country than it has been at any time in my adult life. So underneath the tide of bad news, there's also, I think, a growing sense of control and confidence.
And just a reminder, we are a little short on time, so just make sure, let's keep it to one question and be as brief as possible for this time.
Hello.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ambassador Kimani, for your remarks. Kind of picking up on the topic of your remarks around shared narratives across Africa, I think one narrative that existed during the Cold War was around the non-aligned movement, and how countries during that time of great power competition, trying to situate themselves in a unique position. Do you see a new emergence of that right now, or how different countries can align themselves beyond just Africa in the world today?
I'll answer that real fast. The non-aligned movement is a tremendously important movement for what used to be called the third world, which was actually never meant to describe like thirds and third levels. It's, not there, not first or second. So at the time, the clash between the Soviet Union and, broadly speaking, the West was an intensely ideological clash. It was a clash of ideas. I don't see that now. I don't see that now. And I don't think that there's anything to be non-aligned about when it comes to protecting those principles I talked about. Self-determination, territorial integrity, sovereignty. These, Kenya is not non-aligned for. We're aligned for them. So if you're against them, we do not take the middle part to be where we stand. Now, there will be in the future, I believe, a more ideological struggle between the different economic visions of how to achieve wealth. And there will be an argument that you can get rich and strong without electoral democracy. And there'll be the prevailing, quote unquote, Western view that I believe there will be a contest of that kind. And at that time, I will wait to see what non-aligned will mean in these two senses. I believe it may be a sort of third way, but it hasn't appeared in a clear way right now. So I want to not deride those countries and diplomats who align, who explain their abstentions as being part of the non-aligned position. I just want to say that for African people, territorial integrity is the very cornerstone of us dealing with a predatory, dangerous international system.
We'll go behind, and then Eric, if there's a question I'm going to talk about in the virtual space.
Thank you for having this session. So I just wanted to know your take on the African continent free trade area, especially with respect to regional insecurities that we have and the teeming population that have been struggling and competing for employment. So how realistic do you think the free trade area could be right now when we have a teeming youth population and we have regional terrorism here and there? Do you think it's a threat to the free trade area? Thank you.
When you're in trouble, sometimes an incremental won't do. Sometimes you need a radical break. You need to take a sprint for the fences, or take whatever it is. What is it? Swing for the fences. The African free trade area is such a transformative idea, but it is still not been realized. It is new. And our experience in the East African community tells us that there's a lot of work you have to do to lower barriers and to enable trade. So one of the big items is the infrastructure deficit that African countries have. We have to close that infrastructure deficit if we're to trade with each other. If trading with each other is so expensive, we won't be able to do it. So there's a lot of work to do with joint infrastructure development, regional infrastructure development. And you see that in the East African community. We try where, as you're linking a road, the Kenyan road, a road from Kenya to the Ethiopian border, the Kenyan government would discuss with the Ethiopian border, are you going to build your side and then we build our side? And that is really a big part of regional integration. If we trade more with each other, we get wealthier. And it needs to be said that as the world is becoming more protectionist, Africa is becoming more open and more open to one another. I think it's tremendously promising. And we have to find a way to grow our economies in an employment positive way. Because young Africans need jobs. And if we're not giving them jobs, they fall prey to a lot of political spoilers, a lot of people recruiting them into forms of criminality and militancy that really only describe their lack of opportunity. The threats from terrorism, etc., are very real, very real. But I like that Africa is not, and I say this as a former official in counterterrorism, is the counterterrorists can never win you the war against terrorist groups. They can only hold back, limit the damage, but to win, you in a way have to re-engineer your country. You have to re-engineer people's sense of inclusion, people's sense of belonging, and people's sense of opportunity and optimism in a national project. And for that, there's a lot of work to do. And so the African Free Trade Area may be what provides the engine, the economic engine to realize this remaking or reinvigoration of our nations.
So at max capacity, we had about 80 people online joining us. Right now we have almost 70. And people are asking a lot of questions about your speech mentioned history and identity. So we have a couple questions in that thread. I'll lump some together. One asks, how can writers and artists connect their specific stories and art to these debates about the larger African story and narrative? We have a question about how can we relate to each other and influence our authentic history and undo the experience of generational trauma from colonialism? And then we have a question about treating Africa as this homogenous entity. We're constantly referencing as Africa, but we should be looking more specifically. And by blending country or regional issues into one entity, don't we limit our thinking? So I'll just leave those on the floor.
Those
5 minutes or less.
5 minutes or less. Okay, John. Look, we're in the United States where hip hop started here, maybe was inspired by certain African forms of cultural expression, and it became a global language of young people expressing themselves. Afrobeat is there now, and it's now doing the reverse, it's coming here. By the way, I anticipated this years ago when I said one day Beyonce will get together as a Congolese musician and the whole world will go crazy. So it's all about the artists. It's artists offer us the sight, a vision of things unseen, possibilities we have never considered. And art and artists and writers have to be at the center of how we tell this story. And it is crucially important that African governments, policymakers never underestimate the power of art. Because we have so many urgent issues. You know, are you going to vaccinate the kids first or give artists commissions, you know? So inside that prioritization of budget lines, I hope that we can support artists because African artists have so much to say. And that leads to the second point. By talking about the African story, we're not talking about homogeneity, we're not talking about flattening, we're talking about a larger arc of story. And within it are all our different experiences. And what they have in common is just some of these principles and perspectives of who we are as a very diverse, very different groups of people who are changing so rapidly. But when we lack that sense of united action, united perspective, then unfortunately, the divisions among us, and the differences, and our limited viewpoints, where we think only about my own perspective right now, we all suffer because there are those who are waiting on the sidelines to take advantage of just that division and difference to entrench their own visions on us. So it's not to be homogeneous. Indeed, Africa is not a country, but we can do with an openness. There was once a debate in Kenya about what should be our national dress. And some people went and designed, they thought hard and long way, fashion, and they designed, but very few Kenyans wear what they designed. And I always thought, this is a personal perspective. Please, anyone watching in Nairobi, sorry. I always thought, why not just make every form of Kenyan dress Kenyan? Well, why does it have to be one outfit? Why can't they all just be labeled as Kenyan so I can change from one to the other as I feel fit? It's that sense of inclusivity, of diversity that is part of this story.
Yeah. Okay, so I think there was one over here, so let's go here to the last question. Thank you.
I really appreciate how you said that you have nothing to apologize for in terms with China. My question, and you caveated these are your personal views, so my question is more about Kenya specifically and the upcoming elections. And I was wondering, from someone not in Kenya right now, from the outsider's perspective, what are the key issues on the table according to you, and what's up? What's the main issue right now for the elections?
Okay, so that's a tough question. Kenya is, from best as I can see, Kenya is debating what are we to do for young Kenyans. That's the key question being debated. And the different political groupings are all trying to answer it in their own way and have a different perspective. What we have in Kenya is a highly impatient population of young Kenyans who have ticked all the boxes we told them to tick. You know, we tell them just go to school, finish school, and you can be okay. Then they finish school, the job is not there. That little ladder that was supposed to be there is not there. We have to provide it, and I think that's what this election is about. I think the election is going to deepen our democracy. I think it's going to bring many new ideas and many new people into office. I've noticed over time, Kenyan legislators and leaders becoming younger, becoming more diverse in their experiences. And Kenyan voters are extremely ruthless when it comes to the legislators. Like, there are very few who, given our history, usually we kick out like 80%. So this time, it may not be as high, but certainly you see a lot of new talent coming in.
And our last question is actually from our our African Caucus colleague, Haja. So.
Yeah, I'm sorry to take this one away. Thank you so much, Ambassador Kimani. As a young African, someone who was born and raised in Africa, and when I moved to the US, one of the greatest misunderstandings that I encountered about Africa is just that one single picture of people waiting to be saved, people waiting to receive aid. And much of my experience living in the US has been countering that narrative and engaging with people who have those beliefs. So this is a personal question. In your role as ambassador, in your role as African, how do you ground yourself while interacting and engaging with people who have those beliefs that can be very detrimental and dangerous? And for us people who are interested in going back to Africa as Africans, as Americans and working there, what do you leave us with? What should we be looking forward to? How should we engage? How should we go back and engage? Thank you.
Well, it's tough. It's tough. It's tough because there's so many problems in our continent that are crying out for solutions, and there are many, many people who need help. And quite a number of those draw their help from that aid, whether it's food programs for people who are experiencing chronic and dangerous food insecurity, to PEPFAR, which in the US here is giving HIV medicines, malaria, the malaria programs. So one cannot easily dismiss the aid that is provided and the industry that has grown around it. In fact, to do so is easy, but the reality is harder to deal with. We're going to need to lower the cost of capital that Africans need to access. We're going to need to make serious efforts to lower gatekeeping and other actions that distort the entrepreneurial dreams and aspirations of our people. We're going to need to make a serious effort to attack corrupt practices. And we're going to need to increase by a factor our productivity, whether it is agricultural, and move from subsistence farming to more productive farming, to manufacturing and industrialization. To do that, and this is to answer you, we have to change our psychological operating system. Because that question about you desperate people needing aid is a question that caters to the perception that we are broken, helpless people. So that's what I mean, that if we are able to change our operating system, and it's doable because we've done it before, then that question will slowly over time fade, and we will seek to do more collaboration with those who want to invest with us, not just those who think that we've lost the plot entirely. But in the meantime, we have to deal with the reality as it is. But it is not a reality that does much for your dignity, but it's not enough to blame those who provide aid as the problem. The problem is the problems, and when we solve them, we'll be done.
Right. That, on behalf of the Kennedy School, the Belfer Center, our partners in the Africa Caucus and the Center for African Studies, we just want to say thank you so much, Ambassador Kimani, for spending so much of your generous time with us here at the school and for sharing your perspective with us. So I invite the audience to join me in thanking you.